So Jean Grey is Marvel's most tragic superhero, and with Marvel Rivals coming out, I figured it would be a great time to remaster the old video that we did on her character's history in Marvel Comics. As most of you guys probably know, Jean Grey first appeared in X-Men #1 from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby back in 1963. But the reason for her creation, and even the creation of the X-Men themselves, was that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were hoping to capitalize on the popularity of the Fantastic Four, while at the same time trying to appeal to younger readers. And so in addition to their age, the X-Men were set apart from previous superhero teams because they were made of mutants, right? Those individuals whose genetics give them powers. Now, one of the things that I do want to specify here, since we might as well nip this in the bud right now, is that in Marvel Comics, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar, yes, mutants get their powers from the X gene, but X gene activation is not universal, which is to say 99% of the time, the X gene activates during puberty. But the X gene can also activate during moments of high duress, or it can be turned on externally. Exodus is a really good example of a mutant whose power is activated later on in life by someone else. In this particular case, it was Apocalypse. Magneto, on the other hand, his powers activated as an adult during a moment of high duress when his daughter Anya was killed in a fire set by the local villagers. And so with Jean Grey, it was very much the same way. Because while Jean Grey does have various origins in Marvel, X-Men Origins Jean Grey from 2008, Uncanny XMen 241, the best source for her origin actually comes from Bizarre Adventures. It's an old black and white comic that originally focused on Kazar, basically Marvel's Tarzan, but for issue number 27, Chris Claremont wrote the backstory to her character. And what he established here was that at some point in her younger years, Jean Grey was playing with a friend of hers named Annie, who was hit by a car and killed. Now, before Annie died, Jean Grey's powers manifested due to the stress of the situation, and she formed a telepathic link with Annie and experienced her dying moments. Now, as you can imagine, this traumatized the hell out of Jean. And so for a while, she became incredibly reserved and disconnected from the people around her. And so her parents took her to any number of mental health professionals, only for one of them to direct them to Professor Charles Xavier, who met with Jean, basically established that she was a mutant, and then agreed to take her in at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting with her character. When Jean Grey originally debuted in Marvel, the only real power that she had was telekinesis. It wasn't until later on in the X-Men comics, with writers like Roy Thomas, Arnold Drake, and Gary Friedrich, that we actually learned that Jean Grey had telepathy. Of course, that little tidbit of information came long before her origin story, and that because of her origin and her traumatic experience with Annie, what Professor Xavier had done is he had actually suppressed her telepathy until such a time as she was able to get past her emotional turmoil and learn how to handle her telepathic powers. So again, for a while, all you really had was telekinesis. Now, another thing to add in here that was also brought in with Bizarre Adventures number 27 is that when Jean Grey had experienced the death of Annie firsthand, right, experiencing it the way that Annie had experienced it, she let out a kind of telepathic cry. And what that did is it alerted Xavier to her presence. So by the time he showed up on the scene and met with her parents, he basically already knew who she was. But the other person who was alerted to Jean's existence was the Phoenix Force. Now, we'll talk more about that here in a minute as we get into the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas. But in the early issues of the X-Men comics, these are pretty standard superhero fare, with the focus of the stories on mutants trying to gain acceptance in the world, and like other Marvel comics at the time, focusing on interpersonal dynamics. For Jean Grey, who at the time was known as Marvel Girl, she was the only female on the team, and so in a lot of ways, the other members of the team, all the other guys, were constantly gunning after her in some form or fashion. But it became pretty apparent very, very fast under Lee and Kirby that Cyclops would be the romantic interest of Jean. Something else to point out here is that in the early stories of her character in the X-Men, she was quite literally the damsel in distress, right? She always kind of had to be rescued by Cyclops because she was always being overwhelmed by what was going on. And in a lot of ways, that was done to sort of build the connection between the two. She was in danger, Cyclops would rescue her, and it's like, oh God, Cyclops, if it wasn't for you, that kind of thing. That's the feeling that you got in those early stories. By X-Men Volume 1, issue number 60, Jean Grey and Cyclops had basically made it official. But what made this somewhat bittersweet in the original run is that 6 issues after it becomes official, the X-Men comics were canceled because of low sales and the fact that the team just didn't really resonate with readers the way that Marvel hoped they would. And so there were no new issues of X-Men comics published between 1970 and 1975. So for nearly 5 years, Jean Grey was just relegated to cameo appearances in a handful of other titles like Avengers and Captain America. But something that I want to add in here that's not part of the original run is something called X-Men the Hidden Years. Now, X-Men The Hidden Years was launched in 1999 by John Byrne. It only lasted about 24 months and was canceled after 22 issues due to everything going on with Grant Morrison, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But X-Men The Hidden Years was designed to fill in the gap between the original X-Men comics after they were canceled and the launch of giant-size X-Men. What's particularly important here is that in X-Men The Hidden Years, issues 8 and 9, there comes a point in that story when Jean Grey is possessed by the Phoenix Force. And it's the first time that the Phoenix had actually taken possession of Jean, and the first time that Jean had actually understood what the Phoenix was. Now, in that moment, it's the two of them kind of getting a feel for each other, but it's also Jean, while being possessed by the Phoenix, speaking directly with the Fantastic Four. And the long and short of it is that she will become a host for the Phoenix. So don't freak out when it happens. It was a way to kind of retroactively bookend to the start of the Phoenix saga, and why it was that when Jean became the Phoenix, the X-Men weren't really as surprised as you would have expected them to be. It was very, very subtle, but it was still a pretty important part of the Jean Grey mythos. But having said that, in 1975, Marvel released Giant-Size X-Men #1, which would really reignite interest in the X-Men team. The long and short of the story was that the original X-Men were trapped on the living island of Krakoa, and so Xavier had to recruit a new team in order to save them. And yes, we are skipping over the story of X-Men Deadly Genesis, but what ends up happening is that the new team rescues the old team, and once the whole mission is done, Angel, Iceman, and Beast effectively leave, which is to say, in April of 1975, this comic came out. In that same month, Beast took off to join the Avengers with issue number 137. In July of 1975, Angel and Iceman were rolled over to the Champions of Los Angeles. Now, the reason why that matters will come to bear in the aftermath of our discussion about the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas as far as Chris Claremont's original plan for Jean went. But by issue number 100, Chris Claremont officially starts the very beginnings of the Phoenix saga. Now, one thing to specify here is that when Chris Claremont became writer of the X-Men, initially he wanted to tell it as a kind of soap opera, focusing a lot on interpersonal dynamics. For Jean Grey specifically, one of the biggest issues that Claremont had was that as the damsel in distress, she was every female superhero ever in the history of comic books up to that point in time, minus a couple of people. She was essentially the golden age archetype of Lois Lane. And so what Chris Claremont wanted to do was elevate Jean Grey, right? To make her far more pronounced, to make her far more significant, and then ultimately send her off into the sunset with a kind of farewell. And so the way that Uncanny X-Men #1 unfolds going into the Phoenix saga is that the X-Men, which is to say Cyclops, Professor X, and Jean, are kidnapped by a guy named Stephen Lang. Now, Stephen Lang was the most recent head of the Sentinel program at that point in time, taking over the program after Bolivar Trask had been defeated, and the Sentinel program itself had been co-opted by the government. The other side of the X-Men roster goes on a rescue mission for Cyclops, Jean, and Xavier. But the problem is that during this rescue, all of Stephen Lang's forces had used up the escape pods to escape, which basically left the X-Men stranded on a craft that was about to be hit by solar flares and kill everybody. So they end up finding a shuttle that they can use to escape, but the autopilot feature has basically been disabled, meaning someone will have to manually pilot the craft back to Earth. Now, this is a problem because whoever the pilot will be stuck in the cockpit while the rest of the team is in a shielded chamber in the back of the shuttle, meaning the rest of the team will escape the solar flare and the pilot will be destroyed by it. And so Jean volunteers to use her telekinetic powers to pilot the craft, saving the rest of the team as the ship crash lands into Jamaica Bay. Now, at that point in time, Jean Grey was believed to be dead, but then of course you get that iconic moment from the story where Jean Grey emerges from the water saying, "I am Phoenix," with a whole new outfit, and promptly passes out. Now, what we ended up learning in Uncanny X-Men issue number 101 was that in these moments, when the shuttle was crash landing into Jamaica Bay, Jean Grey was about to die, the Phoenix Force appeared to her, and there were two major revelations that came with this. The first was that at the time when Jean had formed a telepathic link with Annie and Annie was dying, Jean Grey was going to be pulled into the afterlife with Annie, and it was actually the Phoenix that severed that link and essentially kept Jean Grey alive. The second revelation here was that the Phoenix had the power to save Jean's friends if Jean was willing to allow the Phoenix to bond itself to her, and even willing to admit the fact that she would sacrifice herself for her friends, kind of the perfect act of love. And so by the time the ship had crash landed into Jamaica Bay, the Phoenix had fully bonded with Jean. And so following this, Jean's taken to the hospital hospital and recovers for a few issues until Xavier's school is attacked by a villain known as Eric the Red, who'd enlisted the help of Firelord, a cosmic character who was serving as the Herald of Galactus at that point in time. But Jean, at that point, had recovered enough to be able to join into the battle, and then displays that as the Phoenix, she's vastly more powerful than before, and she's even able to go toe-to-toe with Firelord, which was a demonstration of the fact that even in a semi-injured state, she was immensely powerful. Now, the X-Men pursue Eric the Red through an interdimensional gateway and discover that he's a member of a race called the Shi'ar, and that he's trying to help a fellow member named Daken take control of the Empire from his sister Lilandra. Now, as the X-Men fight Daken's forces, Jean learns that Daken is using something called the M'Kron Crystal, which is basically an unlimited source of cosmic power. I always likened it to a hallway of doors for the multiverse, right? Meaning the actual hallway is the inside of the M'Kron Crystal, each door leading to a different reality. But regardless of how you slice it, there's an immense amount of power within that place. And what ends up happening in the story is the crystal actually pulsates, causing all of reality to flicker for an instant and potentially end all life in the universe. Now, at one point, the X-Men are actually transported inside the crystal, and it starts to fracture. And so the Phoenix attempts to hold it together, but cannot do it on her own. So she ends up absorbing the life force of Storm and Corsair, the father of Cyclops, and with those powers combined, she's able to repair the M'Kron Crystal and transport the X-Men home. There also has to be a Captain Planet joke in there somewhere. But for a while, things seem pretty fine for the X-Men within Marvel Comics. And in fact, with Jean Grey getting a drastic buff and the amount of power that she had, it led for some pretty intriguing stories to be told during this interim period between the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas in Marvel, specifically in relation to how Cyclops viewed her, the kind of struggles he had on a personal level, that she no longer needed to be saved anymore. A lot of this was an in-comic book metaphor for what Chris Claremont saw going on out in the world, right? Women's liberation, feminism, that sort of thing. And so what ends up happening is all this comes to a head in the Dark Phoenix saga. The reason why was because at this point in time, the Hellfire Club, which was a secret mutant society that tries to control the world from behind the scenes, they wanted to use the power of the Phoenix to achieve their ends. And so to do that, they end up using the influence of one of their members named Jason Wingard, also known as Mastermind, who can manipulate the five senses. Now, on his own, he's not necessarily powerful enough to trick Jean Grey as the Phoenix. This was actually done by a device that was created by Emma Frost that amplified his powers. But what ends up happening is that in ensnaring Jean Grey by quite literally tricking her into believing they're on a Victorian-era boat, she almost completely comes under his thrall. The only real connection that keeps her from total control by Jason Wingard is the connection she has with Cyclops. And so what ends up happening is the other members of the X-Men launch a rescue mission to try to save Jean. And in the midst of this rescue mission, Jason Wingard creates an illusion that Cyclops had been killed. And this was kind of Chris Claremont's way of showing that the X-Men, the Hellfire Club, and even us as the readers had drastically underestimated the connection between Cyclops and Jean, that it was much deeper than the fact that they were in love. And in fact, what happens is that when Jean truly believes that Cyclops has been killed, she snaps. She attacks Mastermind, puts him in a catatonic state, and then just goes absolutely psychotic, even trying to kill Cyclops and tearing the Blackbird to pieces. But the one thing that stops her from killing Cyclops is actually the inner turmoil inside her own mind, because we end up finding out that these two forces are opposing one another. The Phoenix has just sort of gone crazy and wants to destroy everything, whereas Jean Grey is trying to keep the Phoenix in check. And so with Jean Grey realizing that she wouldn't be able to control the Phoenix forever, that its influence was quickly overtaking her, she effectively takes off. And by the time she arrives at the Dabari star system, the Phoenix has almost total control. It ends up basically absorbing an entire star, and when it does that, it obliterates the entirety of the star system, which kills billions of people. And so following this, once Jean Grey comes back to Earth, there is a kind of reprieve here, where the X-Men do what they can, and even Xavier himself engages Jean in a psychic battle in order to kind of rebuild the mental blocks that keep her telepathy at bay to a degree, but would also allow for the containment of the Phoenix Force persona, so at the very least, even if only for a moment, it wouldn't destroy everything. It would buy the X-Men time and give Xavier enough time to figure out how to teach Jean to control her powers. What ends up happening is that the Shi'ar arrive on the scene and make this declaration that Jean Grey has to die. And so following that, there's a kind of battle to the death that takes place on the blue area of the moon, something akin to honorable combat. If the X-Men win, Jean Grey survives, right? She gets to go on and X-Men live her life. If the X-Men lose, specifically if they lose to the Shi'ar Imperial Guard, the most elite fighting force in the Marvel Universe, then Jean Grey will be sentenced to death. And as the fight goes on further and further and further, and the X-Men are continually defeated, Jean Grey starts to realize that the only thing that can really spare everybody here is if she's willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. And so in the now iconic Uncanny X-Men issue 137, Jean Grey activates a Kree weapon that completely atomizes her, and she dies on the spot. Now, here's the kicker to this. This was not supposed to happen. So a little bit of behind the scenes information for those of you guys who are interested here. The way this was supposed to go down was that there wasn't even supposed to be a battle on the blue area of the moon. If you read Sean Ho's book, Marvel the Untold Story, and you watch the Amazon documentary, Claremont's X-Men, what you end up learning is that the Shi'ar were going to come to Earth, they were going to arrest Jean Grey, and then she was going to be put on trial. She was going to lose the trial, and then she was going to serve a kind of prison sentence. At the end of that prison sentence, she would be released. But because of the emotional ordeal of the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas, that her and Cyclops would quit the X-Men and they would walk away. And because of what was going on at that point in time with Beast on the Avengers, Iceman and Angel on the Champions, it would have allowed Chris Claremont to basically remove the last two holdouts of the original X-Men team and focus the comics exclusively on the team that was provided in giant-size X-Men. But when this whole storyline was pitched to Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief of Marvel, he shot it down. His argument was that because Jean Grey destroyed a whole star system, she needs to suffer consequences that are equal to the number of lives that she had destroyed. So we're talking corporal punishment, right? Whipping her publicly. It was some pretty brutal stuff. And so Chris Claremont and John Byrne have this idea where they go to Jim Shooter and they tell him, if you don't let us do the ending that we want, we're going to kill Jean Grey. Jim Shooter calls their bluff and makes them kill Jean. And if they refuse, he would have just taken them off the comic and replaced them with somebody else. And because Chris Claremont and John Byrne guarded the comic so jealously, if Jean was going to die, they were going to be the only ones to write it the way that they thought it should be done. Hence this ending that you got. So yeah, a lot of politicking that was going on in Marvel at that point in time. And so following her death in 1980, we don't really see Jean Grey again for several years in the comics. And in fact, the story that you saw in Marvel Comics with Madeline Pryor, that was supposed to be the story of Jean. And we'll talk about that here in a second, because what this does is this transitions into Avengers issue number 163 in 1985, when the Avengers find a cylinder at the bottom of Jamaica Bay where Jean had crashed the space shuttle at the beginning of the Phoenix saga. Now, each time they try to approach it, they hear a telepathic message warning them to stay away, and it becomes clear that whatever or whoever is in the cylinder simply wants to stay there. Now, eventually they're able to retrieve it and then hand it over to the Fantastic Four to figure out what's going on, only for Jean Grey to emerge. Now, that part of Jean Grey waking up actually takes place in Fantastic Four issue number 286, but when that happens, she doesn't have any memory of anything that had taken place between the time that she crash landed in Jamaica Bay and this moment. And the reason why was because of a gigantic retcon at Marvel Comics, the merits of which are still being debated by X-Men fans to this day. That in the aftermath of Jim Shooter forcing Chris Claremont and John Byrne to kill Jean Grey, Jim Shooter realized the popularity of Jean, that it was actually the highest it had ever been. And wanting to capitalize on that, he chose to bring Jean Grey back. Now, what he ended up doing was approaching Chris Claremont in order to make that happen. But Claremont shot the idea down, right? In his mind, he didn't want to see Jean Grey return. Cyclops was finally getting its happy ending with Madeline Pryor. It wasn't the exact vision that he imagined, but it was still working out in something akin to it nonetheless. And so what ends up happening is that Jim Shooter goes to a guy named Bob Layton, who's going to be writing a new comic called XFactor. And he basically has Bob Layton write the return of Jean Grey in the XFactor comic. And this is a big to-do, because what we end up learning in this particular story is that when the Phoenix Force had come to Jean Grey in these final moments of her life and offered her the deal of saving the X-Men, what it actually did is it duplicated her physical form, that the actual Jean Grey was just sitting in stasis in the bottom of Jamaica Bay the whole time. So everything that had happened between the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas was never actually Jean. And so following this, the original X-Men, right, Jean, Cyclops, Angel, Iceman, and Beast, they ended up forming XFactor. Within the pages of XFactor number 1 from Bob Layton and Jackson Geese, we get that highly controversial moment where Cyclops, who was supposed to ride off into the sunset in Anchorage, Alaska with Madeline Pryor and his son Nathan, actually abandons Madeline and Nathan and goes back to Jean Grey, which was a pretty shady part of his history. But with the original X-Men team back, albeit under a different name, the XFactor book was incredibly popular with fans and saw some massive moments, like the debut of Apocalypse and the transformation of Angel into Archangel. And this team would stick around for a relatively long time, with Jean Grey as one of its focal points, often crossing over with the other books like Uncanny XMen and New Mutants for huge crossover events like Mutant Massacre, Fall of Mutants, Inferno, and Extinction Agenda. I do have videos on all of these except for Extinction Agenda if you want to check them out. But what ends up happening is that after about 70 issues in 1990, XFactor's canceled. And the reason for that was that in 1991, the comics industry had changed in a drastic way with the release of X-Men Volume 2, Issue Number 1. The Uncanny X-Men line and even the X-Men comics themselves had become so incredibly popular that Marvel realized that in relaunching the line, they could actually draw in more readers that way. Now, something that I do want to specify here is that between Jean's return in the XFactor comics and the launch of X-Men Volume 2, Issue Number 1 in 1991, it's not to say that there were no significant moments with Jean, but I would go so far as to say that a lot of the moments with Jean had less to do with the evolution of her character and had more to do with her perception of the world around her. A really good example of this is Rachel Summers. That Rachel Summers was the daughter of Cyclops and Gan from Days of Future Past, which at this point in Marvel's history had now become an alternate universe. Rachel Summers was time displaced. She'd arrived in the main Marvel universe. She was part of Excalibur for a period of time, but in Days of Future Present, she actually met her parents. And so it was a cool element to see Jean and Cyclops meeting a child they had never had from a future that's no longer the guaranteed future of the main Marvel universe. There also was, of course, the huge love triangle between Cyclops, Jean, and Wolverine, a plot thread that had been going on for years within Marvel Comics. But kind of getting into the 1990s, again, this is when we saw the launch of X-Men Volume 2, Issue Number 1. By this point in time, Marvel had realized that the X-Men were so incredibly popular, and Jean's popularity was still at a fever pitch, if for no other reason than her time in the X-Factor comics, that Marvel realized if they got rid of the original X-Factor team, they combined the X-Men into one team and then relaunched it, it would actually bring in a whole new wave of readers, which is exactly what it did. Specifically, the new X-Men team was split into two groups, X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue. X-Men Gold appearing in X-Men Volume 2 and X-Men Blue appearing in Uncanny X-Men. Jean herself became a member of the Gold team, which was led by Storm and included Colossus, Psylocke, Iceman, Archangel, and Forge. But the next big event in Jean's story didn't actually occur until 1994 with X-Men Volume 2, Issue Number 30, which features her wedding to Cyclops after a very long romance between the two. And for a time, throughout the first half of the 1990s, Jean Grey and the X-Men are exceedingly popular, not only because of the stories that had come before, but because of TV shows like X-Men the Animated Series. But by the late 1990s, the X-Men had dropped off in popularity drastically. Now, there is a whole behind-the-scenes explanation for that. I think that has less to do with Jean and more to do with the X-Men themselves, so we'll kind of jump to Grant Morrison's run. The reason for this was that with Marvel recovering from near bankruptcy, Marvel ended up reaching out to Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti at Event Publications to help them basically launch stories under the Marvel Knights imprint that would allow Marvel to basically publish their lesser popular characters at a fraction of the cost. Marvel also did this with Jim Lee, which is why you got the Avengers Ultra Force crossover in the 1990s. But as a kind of you scratch our back, we scratch yours, by the time the year 2000 came around, Joe Quesada had been moved up to editor-in-chief. And what he saw was an opportunity to not quite rework or reboot the X-Men per se, but at the very least, to shift how the stories were being handled. And so the X-Men were handed over to Grant Morrison. Now, I know we're talking a lot about the X-Men here, but I feel like their history and Jean kind of goes hand in hand with regards to this stuff. But what ends up happening is that the X-Men are rebranded as the new X-Men, and specifically in relation to Jean, there's a couple of huge developments that go on here. One of the most notable developments here is the psychic affair that Cyclops had with Emma Frost. This creates a massive rift between himself and Jean, that while it wasn't necessarily physical, for Jean, it constituted a violation nonetheless. And it was kind of Grant Morrison's way of establishing that Jean Grey was essentially on her way out, and that Emma Frost was going to take her place. This violation was particularly exacerbated by the fact that new X-Men under Grant Morrison actually saw Cyclops and Jean Grey operating as dual headmasters for the newly opened Xavier School. So they were kind of the power couple. So again, this was a huge torpedo for the character of Jean. But the next thing that happened was that Jean died again. And this comes as a result of the X-Men taking on a new member named Zorn, whose face remained covered by a helmet because he supposedly had the power of a sun inside of his head, so he had to keep it contained at all times. But it turns out that Zorn was actually Magneto, who turns on the X-Men and under the influence of a power-enhancing drug called Kick, launched an attack that results in thousands of New Yorkers dying and Jean Grey being mortally wounded. Now, Wolverine ends up having to deal a mercy killing to Jean, and then later on, kills Magneto because of the fact that Jean Grey died. Now, following this, Jean Grey finds herself inside the White Hot Room. Now, something that I wanted to specify here, and it's one of the reasons why I waited this long to do it, it wasn't quite the first time that Jean Grey had experienced any measure of an afterlife. In fact, in Classic X-Men issue number 43, which was a comic designed to either reprint existing X-Men stories or simply reprint those stories with new material added in that particular issue, in the aftermath of Jean Grey dying at the end of Dark Phoenix saga, that she had actually met with the cosmic entity Death, and the two of them began erecting these pillars that would basically be occupied by the spirits of those individuals who had been destroyed when Jean Grey eradicated that whole star system. But it was Jean Grey understanding her role within the greater Marvel universe, in the sense that because Jean was kind of a perfect host for the Phoenix, i.e. they were essentially destined to be together, that she's the perfect host for the Phoenix within the Marvel universe, and even arguably across the whole multiverse. Her life would always be some measure of death and resurrection. There was no real way to get past that, because that's what the Phoenix represents, death and rebirth. And the reason why I bring it up here is because in the aftermath of Jean Grey's death during Grant Morrison's new X-Men, it's actually the first time in Marvel that you see Jean Grey truly die, and then Marvel acknowledging that death and then bringing her back, as opposed to the Dark Phoenix saga, where she died, and then Marvel said, well, actually, no, she didn't. She was in the bottom of Jamaica Bay the whole time. So continuing this on, when Jean Grey was in the White Hot Room, what she actually did was send a telepathic message to Cyclops telling him to move on and to be happy with Emma, which he does. That thread, of course, takes place in a story called Here Comes Tomorrow. But from the White Hot Room, Jean Grey's role as the perfect host for the Phoenix is essentially fleshed out here, in the sense that she's more powerful than she's ever been and is actually able to manipulate reality as the White Phoenix of the Crown, which isn't really a physical entity, but represents the soul of Jean Grey fully bonded with the Phoenix. Now, of course, the Phoenix Force heals in the White Hot Room, remaining pretty much dormant until the Shi'ar resurrect it before it's done healing, and 2005's Phoenix End Song. In this story, the Phoenix Force resurrects the body of Jean Grey to serve as its host, but Jean warns the X-Men, and Wolverine repeatedly tries to kill Jean, which ends up causing Jean to fully bond with the Phoenix yet again, and then return to the White Hot Room. Now, this is where things do get a little bit confusing for her character, specifically in the 2012 event, Avengers vs. X-Men, and what came after, because you do have a version that Jean Grey appears, but let's kind of make sense of this so we can clear up any confusion that may exist. Avengers vs. X-Men does not specifically deal with Jean Grey per se. It actually deals with the return of the Phoenix Force and a character named Hope Summers. But the way this begins to go into Jean is that over the course of Avengers vs. X-Men, Cyclops, who had really just kind of become more and more extreme, reaches a fever pitch when he kills Professor Charles Xavier. It's kind of him symbolically crossing a line that he can't come back from. And so following this, Beast starts to realize the only way to bring Cyclops back is to remind him of who he used to be. And so Beast ends up grabbing the X-Men from the past when they were younger and bringing them into the present day. And that's how you end up getting the time-displaced Jean Grey. Now, truth to tell, this did create a lot of continuity issues in terms of this time-displaced Jean learning about what would happen to her over the course of her life, and the statement that she has to let those things happen because the timeline has to stay intact. It was a concept that was seemingly great on paper, but in execution, while there were some great moments in the story, presented a host of problems. But again, kind of focusing on the main Jean Grey herself, she didn't really reappear after the events of Phoenix End Song until her return in 2018. In fact, most of the stories involving Cyclops and potential love interests came by way of his interest in Emma Frost. And so what ends up happening is that in 2018, Marvel launched Phoenix Resurrection, The Return of Jean Grey. Now this time, the X-Men end up discovering that her coffin is empty and figure out that the Phoenix Force had returned to Earth and dug up Jean Grey's grave. Now at first, Jean does not remember anything about her past life, but she eventually starts to remember and is able to convince the Phoenix Force to leave her alone, to stop bringing her back from the dead, and to simply let her live out her life. It was a way for Marvel at that point in time to try to take Jean back to something akin to the person she was. There was kind of this blend between the original Stan Lee Jack Kirby depiction and Chris Claremont's depiction, where she's not quite the damsel in distress, but she's not this godly, overpowered character. And in fact, during this time in Marvel Comics, she had launched her own team called XMen Red, along with Nightcrawler, Namor, and some younger recruits, to try and battle the surge of anti-mutant sentiment that was growing around the world as a result of the return of Cassandra Nova. But in 2019, the X-Men titles got this massive shakeup when Jonathan Hickman took over creative control of the team, and then sets them up on the living island of Krakoa, where they have their own sovereign country and develop a flourishing society. Now at this point, Jean ends up living in the Summers house on the blue area of the moon, alongside Cyclops, his two brothers Havoc and Vulcan, a teenage version of Cable, Rachel Summers, and Wolverine for some reason, which actually kind of makes sense. I want to say there's a point in the story where the two of them were all getting it on in a hot tub. It was kind of wild, truth to tell. But Jean also serves as part of the Quiet Council, which is the governing body of Krakoa. Now, full transparency here, a lot of what happened at the beginning of the Krakoan age under Jonathan Hickman was world building. And in fact, it wasn't really until the formation of an official X-Men team that Jean Grey actually went back out into the field. Up until that point in time, she was just sitting on the council, helping to make decisions on how Krakoa would run, how it would work, the resurrection protocols, different things like that. But every year, the mutants on Krakoa would throw a lavish party that was called the Hellfire Gala, and they would invite basically anybody and everybody who was significant within the superhero community. But during the third Hellfire Gala, the whole thing is attacked by Orcus, which Jonathan Hickman had introduced as a staunchly anti-mutant group trying to find a way to destroy the mutant population. During this conflict, Jean is stabbed and mortally injured, but before she dies, in addition to a couple other actions in order to help the X-Men survive where they can, when they can, that she actually reaches out to Cyclops and Wolverine to tell them that she loved them, and then of course, her mind goes silent. Now, seemingly, that was supposed to be the end of Jean Grey. I can't necessarily speak to that. I can't really find a source that confirms what Marvel's intention with her character was at this point in time, but what I can say is that once she died, her soul went to the White Hot Room. But after spending time in the White Hot Room and looking back at her past to determine where everything went wrong, and realizing that she had to embrace the fact that she and the Phoenix Force are destined to be together, Jean is resurrected with the help of Hope Summers, another individual who had also been a host for the Phoenix Force and who was thought to be the mutant messiah. But after Jean is resurrected during the fall of the House of X, she basically just kind of goes forward in what's now the Stephanie Phillips run, where she's embracing the Phoenix in a way that she just hadn't really done before, and actually goes on a series of missions to use her incredible cosmic powers to travel the universe and save lives. So again, that's kind of what's happening right now within the story. She most recently fought Thanos. That was pretty dope. And that was after fighting Gore the God Butcher. It's a phenomenal run. You guys really should check out either my videos or read the comic. But with that being said, hopefully this gets you guys caught up on the character of Jean, or at least gives you a strong understanding of her history in Marvel. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.